morning mist clings to the rotting brickwork of Severall's Hospital like a shroud that refuses to be lifted by the sun. Located in Colchester, United Kingdom, this sprawling complex once housed thousands of souls who had been cast aside by polite society. The windows stare out like hollow eyes, watching the encroaching forest slowly swallow the remains of the asylum. It is a place where silence is heavy, and the air feels thick with the memories of those who lived and died within these walls. Visitors often report a sudden drop in temperature and the overwhelming sensation of being watched from the shadows. The decay here is not just physical, but seems to seep into the very spirit of anyone daring enough to trespass on these grounds. Built in the early 20th century, Severall's was intended to be a modern solution for mental health care and a beacon of hope. The architects designed the facility using the echelon plan, which arranged buildings in a specific pattern to maximize sunlight and fresh air for everyone. It was a time of optimism when doctors believed that a pleasant environment could cure the afflictions of the mind and soul. The grounds were vast and beautifully landscaped with winding paths and vibrant gardens meant to soothe the troubled patients. However, the grim reality of asylum life soon overshadowed these noble intentions as the facility swelled beyond its capacity. The sheer scale of the institution eventually contributed to the isolation and neglect that would characterize its later years. The hospital opened its doors in May of the year 1913, covering 300 acres of the Essex countryside. It was a self-contained village with its own bakery, laundry, power station, and even a working farm for the patients. The idea was to keep the patients busy and productive, which was thought to be a form of therapy in itself. Men worked on the farm or in the workshops, while women were assigned to the laundry or needlework rooms. For a brief period, the system appeared to work, and the asylum functioned like a well-oiled machine. Yet beneath this facade of order and productivity, there lay a darker truth about the loss of individual identity and freedom. Admissions to Severall's were not always based on severe mental illness, but often on social convenience or moral judgment. Unwed mothers and rebellious teenagers were frequently committed alongside those suffering from schizophrenia or severe depression. Once a person entered the asylum, regaining their freedom became an almost impossible task against the bureaucratic machine. Families would often sign over their relatives and never speak of them again, leaving them to be forgotten by the outside world. This abandonment created a deep sense of despair that permeated the wards and corridors of the hospital. The walls absorbed the silent weeping of those who realized they might never walk through the front gates again. As the decades passed, the population of Severall's exploded, and the staff found themselves unable to cope with the numbers. Beds were crammed into corridors, and day rooms, destroying any semblance of privacy or dignity for the residents. The overcrowding led to increased tension and violence among the patients, creating a volatile and dangerous atmosphere. Nurses and orderlies were stretched to their breaking point, often resorting to harsh discipline to maintain control. The idealistic vision of a therapeutic retreat had completely vanished, replaced by a warehousing system for the unwanted. It was in this environment of stress and misery that the darker chapters of the hospital began. By the 1940s and 50s, the medical community had embraced radical new treatments for mental illness. Severall's Hospital became a testing ground for experimental procedures that are viewed today as barbaric and inhumane. Doctors believed they could shock or cut the illness out of the brain regardless of the cost to the patient. There was no concept of informed consent, and patients were often subjected to these treatments against their will. The screams that echoed from the treatment rooms were ignored or explained away as symptoms of madness. This era marked a descent into a medical nightmare where the cure was often far worse than the disease. One of the most notorious treatments used at the facility was insulin coma therapy, which induced deep comas in patients. Doctors would administer large doses of insulin to drop blood sugar levels, drastically causing the patient to lose consciousness. They believed that bringing the patient back from the brink of death would reset the brain and cure schizophrenia. The procedure was incredibly dangerous and resulted in severe side effects, including obesity and permanent brain damage. Patients were terrified of the treatment, often begging the nurses not to take them to the insulin unit. The mortality rate was significant, yet the practice continued for years in the name of medical progress. Electroconvulsive therapy was another common practice, often administered without muscle relaxants or anesthesia in the early days. Patients were held down by staff while high-voltage electricity was passed through their brains, inducing violent seizures. The force of the convulsions was sometimes strong enough to snap bones and cause severe internal injuries. It was used as a method of control as much as a treatment, with unruly patients threatened with the shock machine. The fear of the treatment room kept many patients in a state of terrified submission. The lingering energy of this pain is said to still inhabit the rooms where the machines once hummed. Perhaps the most chilling procedure performed at Severall's was the frontal lobotomy, which severed connections in the prefrontal cortex. This irreversible surgery was often performed with an ice pick-like instrument inserted through the eye socket. The goal was to calm aggressive or emotional patients, but the result was often a zombie-like state. Personalities were wiped away, leaving behind empty shells of human beings who could no longer feel or dream. The tragedy of these lost lives hangs heavy in in the surgical wings of the abandoned hospital. Many believe that the confused spirits of lobotomy victims still wander the corridors, searching for the parts of themselves that were stolen. The layout of the hospital included a vast network of connecting corridors that stretched for miles underground and above. These long tiled passageways allowed staff to move between wards without going outside, but they also became places of fear. The lighting was often dim, and the acoustics carried the sounds of distress from distant parts of the complex. Patients spoke of the corridors as labyrinths where one could easily get lost and never be found again. Even today, urban explorers describe these tunnels as the most unsettling part of the site. It is in these narrow spaces that the feeling of being followed is most intense and undeniable. During the Second World War, the hospital suffered a direct tragedy that added to its grim history. In August of 1942, the German Luftwaffe dropped a stick of bombs on the hospital grounds. The pilots likely mistook the sprawling industrial layout of the asylum for a factory or military installation. The explosion destroyed the female ward and the laundry, killing 38 women instantly in a blinding flash. The devastation was absolute, and the trauma of the event left a permanent scar on the community. It is said that on quiet nights, the faint sounds of air raid sirens and panic can still be heard. The laundry room, where many of the women died, remains one of the most haunted locations on the estate. Explorers and former staff have reported hearing the phantom sounds of washing machines and the chatter of women. Some have claimed to see shadowy figures moving among the rusted equipment, continuing their eternal labor. The sudden and violent nature of their deaths seems to have trapped their energy in that specific space. It serves as a somber memorial to the innocent lives cut short by the chaos of war. The sorrow in this area is palpable, often moving visitors to tears without them knowing the history. Among the thousands of patients, there is the story of a man named Thomas, who was admitted in 1955. Thomas was a sensitive artist who suffered from mild hallucinations, but was otherwise harmless and gentle. His family could not cope with his eccentricities and committed him to Severals, hoping for a cure. Instead of therapy, Thomas found himself in a brutal regime that stripped him of his art and his dignity. His sketchbooks were confiscated, and he was forced into menial labor that dulled his creative mind. Thomas represents the tragic archetype of the sensitive soul crushed by the asylum system. Thomas spent his days in the garden, trying to find solace in the flowers and the changing seasons. He would scratch drawings into the dirt or on the walls of his cell with whatever he could find. The doctors viewed his artistic compulsion as a symptom of his illness rather than a coping mechanism. They prescribed a course of electroconvulsive therapy to break his fixation and make him more compliant. With each treatment, the light in the eyes of Thomas grew dimmer, and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The artist was slowly being erased, leaving behind a frightened and confused man. One fateful night in November, Thomas was placed in a padded isolation cell after an outburst of frustration. He had been denied access to the garden, which was his only sanctuary from the madness of the wards. The heavy door clicked shut, and the small observation window offered his only view of the world. For 3 days, he was left in the dark, with only a thin mattress and the sound of his own breathing. It was during this isolation that Thomas claimed to be visited by a dark figure. He screamed for the nurses, but his cries went unanswered in the busy ward. When the staff finally opened the door, they found Thomas huddled in the corner, staring blankly at the padded wall. He refused to speak or eat, and his hands were clasped tightly, as if holding an invisible object. The doctors declared that his condition had deteriorated and scheduled him for a transorbital lobotomy. It was the final solution for a patient they deemed incurable, and a burden on the state resources. Thomas was wheeled away to the surgical theater, his spirit already broken by the fear of the unknown. That was the last time anyone saw the gentle artist as a conscious, feeling human being. The surgery was deemed a technical success by the medical staff, but Thomas never spoke another word. He spent the remaining years of his life sitting in a chair in the day room, staring at nothing. When he finally passed away in the 1980s, he was buried in a pauper grave with no marker. However, legend says that his spirit returned to the isolation cell where he spent his darkest hours. Witnesses claim to see a pale figure huddled in the corner of the ruined room, weeping softly. The energy of his despair is said to be so strong it can make grown men feel nauseous. The hospital finally closed its doors in 1997 as part of the Care in the Community Act. The massive complex was left to the elements and the security guards who patrolled the perimeter. For years, it stood frozen in time, with patient files and medical equipment left exactly where they were. It became a magnet for vandals and ghost hunters who were drawn to its macabre history. The closure did not empty the hospital of its inhabitants, but rather left the spirits alone in the dark. The building began to rot, but the atmosphere of suffering remained perfectly preserved. As nature began to reclaim the site, trees grew through the roofs and vines choked the corridors. The juxtaposition of the beautiful greenery and the decaying architecture created a surreal and haunting landscape. It looked like a post-apocalyptic world where humanity had vanished, leaving only its mistakes behind. The peeling paint revealed layers of history, with cheerful colors hiding the drab institution green beneath. Every room held a story, and every artifact found by explorers offered a glimpse into a forgotten life. The hospital became a museum of misery, open only to those brave enough to enter. Urban explorers who ventured into the main hall often reported the sound of a piano playing in the distance. The grand hall was once the center of social life at the asylum, where dances and plays were held. It seems that the echoes of these rare moments of joy have also been trapped in the stone. The phantom music is described as distorted and melancholic drifting through the empty corridors like smoke. When investigators follow the sound, it always fades away before they can reach the source. It is a ghostly reminder of the humanity that tried to survive within the institution. The morgue remains the most terrifying location for anyone visiting the abandoned Severals hospital site. The porcelain slabs where the bodies were washed still stand cold and white against the grime. It is a small building tucked away from the main wards to hide the reality of death from the patients. Those who enter the morgue often report an intense feeling of dread and the smell of formaldehyde. Some have even claimed to be physically pushed or scratched by an unseen force in this room. It is a place where the veil between the living and the dead feels dangerously thin. A group of paranormal investigators entered the site in 2005 to document the hauntings. They set up audio recorders in the isolation wing, where Thomas had been kept decades prior. As they sat in the darkness, asking questions to the empty room, the temperature plummeted rapidly. Their equipment began to malfunction, with batteries draining instantly and cameras refusing to focus. Then a guttural growl was heard by all 3 members of the team coming from the corner. It was not a human sound, but something primal and angry that did not want them there. Panic set in as the team tried to flee the narrow corridor, their flashlights flickering wildly. They heard heavy footsteps, chasing them the sound of boots on broken glass, echoing loudly. It felt as though the hospital itself was contracting, trying to keep them within its belly. They burst out into the night air, gasping for breath and terrified by what they had experienced. When they reviewed their audio recordings later, they found a chilling voice capturing a single word. The voice whispered the name Thomas, followed by a sound that resembled weeping. Security guards patrolling the site have their own stories to tell about the night shift at Severals. Many refuse to enter certain buildings after dark, specifically the old surgical block. They speak of lights turning on and off in buildings that have had no power for 20 years. Dogs used by the security teams will often stop and bark at empty corners, refusing to move forward. The guards have learned to respect the boundaries of the spirits that inhabit the grounds. They know that they are merely guests in a house that belongs to the dead. The admin block, with its grand facade, stands as a symbol of the authority that once ruled the asylum. Inside, the offices remain littered with paperwork, detailing the daily administration of thousands of lives. It creates a stark contrast between the bureaucratic order and the chaotic reality of the wards. Walking through these offices, one can imagine the doctors signing committal papers without a second thought. The banality of evil is palpable here, where tragedy was reduced to statistics and budget lines. It serves as a warning about the dangers of detachment in the face of human suffering. In recent years, demolition has begun on large parts of the Severall site to make way for new housing. The destruction of the buildings has reportedly stirred up the activity, making the remaining structures more volatile. Construction workers have reported tools going missing and strange accidents occurring on the site. Some have walked off the job refusing to work on land that feels so heavy with sorrow. It seems that the spirits are not willing to leave simply because their physical prison is being destroyed. The land itself has absorbed the trauma, and the haunting continues despite the changes. The chapel of the hospital was meant to be a place of spiritual refuge for the patients and staff. However, even this holy ground was not immune to the darkness that plagued the institution. It was here that funerals were held for those who had no family to claim them. The stained glass windows once cast colorful light onto the coffins of the forgotten dead. Now the chapel stands ruinous and open to the sky, a cathedral of decay. Visitors claim to hear the faint sound of hymns being hummed by a choir that is not there. There is a legend of a nurse who worked the night shift in the children ward during the 1960s. She was known for her kindness, but ultimately took her own life in one of the staff cottages. It is said she could not bear the suffering she witnessed daily and the inability to help the children. Her ghost is said to walk the perimeter of the former children ward, carrying a lantern. She is considered a benevolent spirit watching over the site with a tragic sadness. Her presence is a reminder that the staff too were victims of a broken system. As you walk through the overgrown paths today, the silence is occasionally broken by the cawing of crows. The birds seem to act as sentinels, watching every move of the interlopers who disturb the peace. The connection between the natural world and the supernatural seems intertwined at Severall's. The twisted roots of the trees look like grasping hands reaching out from the earth. It creates an atmosphere where reality feels distorted and dreamlike. It is easy to lose track of time and direction in this cursed place. The legacy of Severall's Hospital is one of good intentions, paved with suffering and bureaucratic neglect. It stands as a monument to a time when society chose to hide its problems behind high walls. The ghosts that wander these ruins are not just figments of the imagination, but echoes of history. They demand to be remembered, to have their stories told after a lifetime of silence. The horror of the asylum is not in the supernatural, but in the very real human tragedy it represents. Even as the bulldozers finish their work and new homes rise from the rubble, the energy remains. The new residents of the housing estate may find themselves waking up at night for no reason. They might feel a sudden chill in a warm room, or hear a whisper when no one is there. The history of Severalls is too deep and too dark to be simply wiped away by brick and mortar. The asylum may be gone physically, but its shadow will stretch over this land for generations. It is a permanent scar on the landscape of Essex that will never truly heal. The final exploration of the site leaves one with a lingering sense of dread that is hard to shake. It is the realization that the line between sanity and madness is incredibly fragile. The people who lived and died here were not monsters, but victims of circumstance and biology. Their spirits remain trapped not out of malice, but out of confusion and a desire for acknowledgement. As you leave the gates behind you, the weight of their collective sorrow follows you home. Severalls Hospital is a ghost story that is terrifyingly real, and it is far from over.